Hi, everybody. It's Bob Ost. It's Friday, so this is the True Community Gathering. True, TRU. We're Theater Resources Unlimited, for those of you who don't know us or are just discovering us. We're a company that I founded 32 years ago. Um, I'm a playwright, composer, lyricist, and I wanted to figure out why I wasn't getting produced more often, and I decided it was because I didn't have any producer friends. And so I actually started hanging out with some theater companies and discovered how hard it was to make theater happen and decided to invite people over to my apartment as producers to talk about how hard it was to produce and maybe find ways to help each other. And so that's how we were founded. It was in my living room. It was a support group for producers. And it's grown over the years, and now we teach things that have to do with theater. And we mostly try to focus on helping people understand the business of theater. Um, artists are a little resistant to really being comfortable with the business, and we try to change that. And we've been doing it for 32 years, like I said. In 2020, we had something called shutdown. For those of you who are history buffs, um, we had shutdown, and I was faced with the problem of how to keep my company running. And somebody introduced me to Zoom. Hello, Zoom, and basically showed me how to do this. And I opened up a Zoom room, and we started having people come in on Fridays. It was originally 4:30. Now it's 5 o'clock. And lo and behold, since 20 April 17th, 2020, this is, I think, our 240th consecutive week of doing these. And oddly enough, I don't know why or how, but oddly enough, we have like 25 to 60 people a week who come into this room. And also they come in from all over the world. So we're no longer a little New York organization. We're global. I mean, I've got people coming in from Australia, UK, Canada, Malaysia, Singapore. So yeah, we're, I guess, global. So you've just found us if you're out there, and I welcome you to True, and I welcome you to our conversations about theater. Um, we've gone long past the conversations about isolation and creating in a vacuum and shutdown and all that. Uh, and now we're really talking of just general topics about theater. One of the things I've been able to do, and I'm grateful that I know people who are generous. I've been able to have like individual theater artists come on for a conversation. We've had Joanna Gleason, we've had Tanya Pinkins, Richard Maltby, bunches of people, Austin Pendleton. Today, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm bringing on a set designer because set designers are a very important part of theater. Um, you wouldn't really like what you would be seeing on Broadway if we didn't have set designers. So I'm going to actually um, bring on my guest. I'm going to ask Beowulf to start his camera if he doesn't have it on already, because I'm not seeing him. Here's my guest, Beowulf Borrit, who has won two Tony Awards, should have won many more, and has. How many shows do you think you've actually designed over these years?
Uh, Close to 500. I don't know what the exact count is, but getting close to 500.
Oh my
Not all on
God.
Broadway, obviously.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your background. I know from reading about you and from emailing a little bit that you didn't really plan on becoming a set designer. Um,
I planned to become a set designer. I didn't think I'd do it professionally. I didn't think it was. I think I didn't think it was possible to do it professionally. I mean, I knew that somebody did. Obviously, I came to shows and I saw there were designers, but um, I my father was a college professor, and that was sort of my first exposure to theater and to set designers. And I thought I would become a design professor. And I guess luckily for me, I ended up going to graduate school at NYU, which brought me into New York, and put me in touch with people who were making a living as designers professionally. And so I think that truly was the thing that made me realize it was like a human being could do it. You could maybe make a living doing it, sort of. Um, and NYU also put me in New York for 3 years of schooling, so I got used to New York City. I began working a little bit professionally while I was in school. And by the time I got out, I had a bit of a network and thought, well, I'll stick around and do this and see how it goes. And 28 years later, I'm still sticking around and seeing how it goes.
I think you've just answered many questions for one of the people in this room. We have a student at Hamilton. Is it Hamilton College University? But he's at Hamilton and he's studying to be a set designer. So I think you may have just given him a little bit of hope. Um, I do want to say, and I do want you to address this. I know that it's extremely difficult to get into the designers union, and uh, not everybody manages to do it. So what was the difference? What made the difference for you? How did you manage to carve a path to being able to work professionally as a designer?
I mean, a lot of good luck is the answer. It's interesting you brought up the union specifically because I took the union exam right out of NYU and was not accepted. And I was so mad that I said, fuck this thing. And wasn't going to join. And I didn't for many years after that. I eventually was working so much in regional theater that I got organized into the union probably 8 years after I had flunked the initial exam. And I'm now active in the union and part of it, but I was pretty irritated when I didn't get in the first time. Um,
I know
and
I know many people who've said the same thing.
um, and I God, it's the question of how you make a career doing it as a designer. I wish I had some kind of an easy answer to it. I really do think luck is the difference between being able to make a living and not. And I've had more than my share of good luck. I started out doing tiny little shows around New York, and the first show I designed in New York was in a 75-seat theater over a grocery store in the South Bronx. And it was a production of Titus Andronicus that I did the costumes for.
I want to say I've
But
been there, but I haven't.
you made they closed down years ago, but it was a wonderful little place, and I designed many shows there early in my career. I worked for them a lot for about 5 years after that. And what I found is I had good practical skills. I could build a set, I could weld, I could paint, I could prop the show, I could sew costumes, I could do all of that stuff. And I was willing to do it all for the design fee on these little shows. And the spaces were so little, it didn't actually take me very long to build the set usually. But the first maybe 5, 7 years of my career, I would just endlessly do tiny little shows. I had one Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx who I'd met who was a pretty good carpenter, who I sort of taught to be a stage carpenter, and we would go around doing these little shows together, and we'd go to Home Depot on a Monday morning with a U-Haul and throw a bunch of 2x4s and plywood in the back, drive to the theater by late morning, spend a day building the set and painting it, and we'd be teching by the end of the day Tuesday, and probably having a performance by Thursday night. And
I
I
just
did
I
that.
just have to say that for a lot of us, it's always a surprise when we find out that somebody that we put on a pedestal that we really admire actually understands what the rest of us do in the trenches. So
Um,
you've been through the trenches.
I have, no, I absolutely have, and I mean, honestly, it is valuable all the way through. I can go to a shop, and I'm having scenery built now where I could not build it myself. I don't have the expertise to build things of the complexity I'm designing now, but I understand the fundamentals of how it all works, and it is helpful in talking with the collaborators, frankly, the carpenters, the painters, the prop people, the electricians, everybody who's making that stuff for me, to be able to have those conversations and have some idea of what they're going through to make the stuff for me, and to hear their ideas on it as well. I don't want to change the design based on technical needs, but often in the sort of discussion back and forth with the people building the scenery, some good idea will come up, and we'll change something based on whatever that is, or a happy accident, whatever it is. Um, but to the larger point, honestly, when I started out, did a little bit of everything. I did scenery and costumes for years. I used to light shows occasionally, although I was a terrible lighting designer. I have done video occasionally. I produced an off-Broadway show early in my career, which because I wanted to give it a try, and I learned that I did not like producing, but I did it because I think I wanted to be in charge, and I have never felt less in control of something in my life than when I was producing in New York.
What was the show? Where'd you do it?
It was a production of Miss Julie. Did it at the Cherry Lane. Scott Schwartz directed it. Uh, and I think several other of the people who were involved in that have gone on to win Tony Awards for it. Michael Aronov, the actor, was in it. Tyler Mickola, the lighting designer, lit it. And I remained for Jessica Niebank, who co-produced it with me, is now the general manager at Lincoln Center. I had a good group of friends when I was young, but we did that one really by our bootstraps. And it was great fun, and it also taught me I probably didn't want to do it again. I used to direct occasionally. I did in college, but I think I did it once or twice professionally, which I enjoyed. But
I just want to say I actually like producing.
excellent. I'm
I
glad
mean,
someone does.
if you have a list of all the things that have to be done and you actually do them and you actually suddenly have this show that's on and you go, wow, I made that happen. It's a good feeling, when all the pieces come together.
Yeah, yeah. Some of it was great. The herding cats part of it was was not my favorite. Um, and so but the point being that I think doing a little bit of everything is fantastic because it gives you more. I certainly have more sympathy with my producers when I'm frustrated at them for whatever, having tried my hand at it as well. And same with all the other parts of it. Um,
So
but
let me ask you something.
yeah.
You won an Obie award. When did you win your Obie award?
Oh, a while ago. I'm not sure I know well, it's on the wall. Let me see if it doesn't have a date on it. 2007, somewhere in there, a while
And
back, maybe 20
was
years ago.
so were you mostly doing off-Broadway at that time, or you already or were you already
Yes, I think I had begun doing some Broadway shows by then, but I certainly was mostly doing off Broadway at that point. I worked just extensively off Broadway in the first, I mean, I still do whenever I get the opportunity, but I did a lot and big and small all over the place.
was that your first award, or were there others before that? I only start
Um,
my book of Beowulf starts at the Obie Awards. So
I think the first thing I ever won was an Adelco Award, which is meant to be for
wow.
black artists. And I designed a show that was basically a black show. Um, the director, all the actors, the writers were all black. I don't, I actually honestly do not know. It's the only time I've ever been nominated for an Adelco and the only time I've ever won one. I don't know if they intentionally don't give them to non-black people or not. I will say that when I won it, the wonderful woman who ran it said, "Oh God, we just gave this to a little white boy." So I think they did not know I was white when they gave me the award. But so I think that was actually the first award I ever won.
So let me ask you
Obie was the
this.
second.
I'm going to ask you another question related to this. Um, how uh, how much more confident did you become when you started winning awards, or did that not make any difference to you? How did it
I
change
didn't.
you, if it did at all?
I don't. I hope it didn't change me at all. I often say all these awards are employee of the month in the theater industry, and you can't take it too seriously. And I don't mean to belittle it either. I very much wanted to win a Tony Award and was irritated that I had not won one for many years before I did. Um, but how it's changed me is that professionally within the industry, it means a lot. I mean, it means a producer is more likely to hire me. It means I'm more likely to get paid better. It means when I ask for something, people are more likely to take me seriously and give me the thing that I'm asking for. It gives you credibility. So that the professional implications of it are massive. Um, and I was very aware of that. And I will say before I won one, there was a whole lot of like, well, that person just won one. Why am I not good enough? But having won a couple of them now, I don't. I'm very glad that I did, and it's a lovely honor. It's a very nice thing when someone says something nice about you, and that's what it is. But I don't think it made me a better artist, or I don't feel like it affected me much that way.
But what you said was very important. What it did do was it gave you credibility within the industry and basically an ability to um, have your ideas taken maybe a little bit more seriously than they might have been otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also like what we do is so unquantifiable, other than like you can say how much money a show is making, you can say how many weeks it ran, you can say those kind of things. And so those are ways we quantify things, and the number of Tony Awards someone has is a way we quantify things. Whether it's a good method or not, I don't know, but it is certainly something that gets tacked onto all of our names in the industry.
How, at what point in your developing as a designer did you realize you had possibly your own aesthetic, or you had a style, or something that you did that was characteristic of a Beowulf Borrit set?
I'm curious what you think is characteristic of a Beowulf Borrit set. Honestly, because I spent many years trying not to have a style. I
That
feel
that's also
like
that is also a good answer.
I feel like it is my job to read the play and talk to the director and kind of take those things and lump them together with my own instincts and make something that is appropriate to all of that, but that the style of that may vary quite a bit based on all of those factors. Now, all that said, I can look at my own work and see like repeating patterns and see things that I like and see things that I think I'm better at and not so good at. And so I think that does add up to style. And
Well, I think all artists have somewhere inside them we have an aesthetic. We have a basic aesthetic. I know that I, as a writer, there are things that I know that I would want to write, and there are things that I think are good examples of how I write. What would you say? What were some sets of yours that you feel were worthy of winning awards that maybe didn't?
Oh God. I don't know that I think about it that way. I can tell you some favorite sets. And
Okay,
I was lucky enough that a couple that won awards were things I was really proud of. I think I think style-wise, the stuff that I have found fascinates me is, and it's what there's the book over my head up there that I wrote, what Transforming Space Over Time. What fascinates me as a set designer and as a storyteller is how can I make a physical world for a story that will help tell that story, but help tell it emotionally and thematically, and also in the way that the way the rhythm of the set moving, changing, shifting, whatever it's doing, can tie into the rhythm of the rest of the storytelling, the rhythm of the writing, the rhythm of the direction, the rhythm of the choreography, the rhythm of the music, to make those things all marry together. And so my more successful stuff is the stuff that does that well. And a lot of that is it's dependent on my collaborators. It's primarily dependent on a director who I have a good relationship with, who we bounce ideas off each other well, who when we get together and talk, there are sparks and we come up with something that I wouldn't have probably come up with on my own, and the director probably wouldn't have come up with on their own. And
then the
between the
colla
two
the
of us,
collaboration the collaboration is hugely important to me. I want to look more at collaboration and how that works for you. So no, but you continue what you were saying.
so that's the stuff that interests me. I often say when I walk into the room for a first meeting, I don't know what the set's going to look like, and I don't care. I will eventually care what it looks like, but right out of the gate, I don't have any particular preconceived whatever. I mean, once I read the script, I'll start thinking of things, and once I talk to the director, I'll think of more things, and hopefully those things will begin to congeal into an idea. But the difference between style and concept is huge to me, and the I've got to get some kind of a conceptual hook into the story, into the theme of the story, and start to feel kind of kinetically how the world is going to move, or how it's going to grow, how it's going to physically exist. And all that stuff will start to tell me what the style ought to be. And then I will probably have quite a strong opinion about what the style ought to be. But I very seldom start there. Uh, Anyway, so I don't know. I think I've rambled a
No, 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 that's
bit.
great. You said great stuff. To what extent do you need to research period when you're doing designing something that's very specific to a period?
I mean, ultimately, I do need to do it. It's not the first thing I do. My father is a historian, and so I feel a little guilty that I don't do more research. But I certainly very seldom start there, and it's not period research, even when I do go there. It's more emotional research, or so, I have a feeling of something, and I'll try to find an image that expresses that feeling, or the set might be this kind of thing, but it seldom has much to do with period style. Eventually, like, if I'm doing Chekhov, I want to know what a Russian doorknob looks like. And even if I don't put a Russian doorknob on the set, I at least want to know that I'm intentionally not doing it or whatever. I think I feel pretty strongly that I'm an artist and not an anthropologist, and I don't care if it's factually right, if it's emotionally right, but I should do the research to know what is factually right, even if I choose to steer away from it. Um,
Well, let's look at two of the two Tony Award winning sets. Let's talk about Act One. What was your process in order to come up with a set that won a Tony Award for that particular play?
I mean,
Revival.
yeah, uh, it, I mean, when I first read the play, it was, I think, about 175 pages long, and it probably had 70 locations. And it was sprawling and just massive. And James always said he's going to cut it down. He was working on it as we developed it. But uh, but even more important than all of that stuff, um, it was the scenes were generally quick. Many of them were less than a page long, so maybe a minute of playing time before you were off to the next location. And at the same time, the locations needed things in them. It was sort of written like a Kaufman and Hart story. So you had kitchen sinks that need to work and doors that need to open and typewriters that people needed to bang on and blah blah blah. But things all the way through. It wasn't as if I was going to put a table and two chairs on stage and our imagination was going to tell us it was this place or this place or this place because so much other stuff had to come into play. Um, and and we were doing it at Lincoln Center, so it was a big stage, and I'd never worked there before, so I actually called up John Lee Beatty, who's a brilliant designer and a friend, and had designed there a lot. And I said, John, just do you have any pointers on how best to design for the Vivian Beaumont? And he probably told me a bunch of things, but the thing that really stuck is he said it's a really wide proscenium, and if you bring on something from stage right, it takes a long time to get to center stage. Um, and so I was doing a play where the scenes were only a minute long. I couldn't be wasting 10, 15 seconds getting them from the wing to center stage, or the play would suddenly be 17 hours long. So I had to find some kind of a solution that was almost instantly going to deliver each of these successive scenes to center stage. Um, and I had a couple of false starts, but even before I showed the first, and I talked to Lapine, we sat down and just talked about it, and not about specifics, but kind of mood and feel. And one of the things he said to me is he felt like it's Moss Hart's autobiography of his early years. He said it's the story of a young man trying to break his way into the theater, and I have this vision of him running up and downstairs, banging on doors, trying to get kick open the doors of his career, literally. Um, so all of that was kind of in my head. I actually came up with a design and called James and said, "Can we have a meeting?" And the night before the meeting, like 5 o'clock, end of the day, I had this sort of nagging feeling that the idea wasn't good enough and James wasn't going to like it. It somehow wasn't grand enough. And the day before this meeting, I had an epiphany, just like pop, this idea came into my head of this kind of multi-story warren of spaces in kind of a skeletal structure that all of the locations could just exist as little kind of cubicles within this space, and that it would rotate and sort of bring what we needed into focus downstage center. And that was sort of all the idea was, but I stayed up all night and I went into my model making supplies and I whipped up a model of this idea. It was probably 2 in the morning before I was done. It was really crude. It was just like broken pieces of other sets kind of shoved together. But it was the idea that ended up on stage a year later, in its very infancy. And I went into a meeting the next morning and I showed James the first bad idea and he agreed it was a bad idea. And then I pulled out the second idea and it took about 5 minutes for him to say, yeah, that's it. That's the right way to do this. And it took the better part of the next 6 months to really figure out the details of it because the thing that I had laid out for him wasn't it didn't really track the scenes properly. It just kind of hit some of the key locations and showed how they might jumble together. And so I spent a long time with him working through the structure of the scenes. We're in this scene, then 30 seconds later we're in this scene, and then we're in this scene, and then we're in a theater, and then we're all the way through to try to work out a structure that physically would allow us to step from place to place to place through the whole show. And we couldn't make it work so that you were never having to do a big turn, but we tended to land those big moves at beats in the show where you needed to take a rest. So Moss Hart could kind of run through life for, 15, 20 minutes, run through all these scenes in fairly quick succession with the turntable that kind of constantly moving. And sorry, I'm talking as everybody knows what this set looks like. I guess I should describe what we came up with. It was ultimately a 60-foot diameter turntable. which is only possible on Broadway at the Vivian Beaumont. Most Broadway theaters, you're lucky if you can get a 25-foot turntable into those stages because they're not big enough. So it was probably twice as big as any normal Broadway turntable. And on that, we built a three-story kind of skeletal structure that was made of kind of wood beams with staircases running through it. But it was 60 feet in diameter, 3 stories tall, and all these little cubicles within it. They were skeletal. There were no walls. It was just beams defining them, and sometimes doors and windows. And then we would put props into each one of those spaces to help define what it was. If it was a producer's office, it was Moss Hart's tenement. Um, and some of them were a little grander. There was a theater proscenium as part of it with like working boxes and a second balcony, and a little working curtain and drops that could fly in and out. And in one chunk of the turntable, there was a mansion that George Kaufman lived in that was much grander than George Kaufman's real house, but it was trying to be sort of the epitome of what you dream for as a young artist. That George Kaufman is the rich and famous writer, and he can afford this mansion. So it was kind of the castle of the fairy tale. All of this existed as one big structure on this giant turntable that would slowly rotate from place to place to place through the story. Occasionally, it would quickly rotate, but usually slowly. And that tracked the play. And it's we I didn't in the end literally make a cubicle for every location, but it was for all the key locations and the ones that we returned to. And then there were kind of some neutral spaces that we could redress. So as it was kind of off in the, well, no, it wasn't, nothing ever went to the wings, but as it was out of focus upstage, the stagehands could get into it and pull out furniture and replace it with new things, and it became a different location. And in that way, we managed to set up the entire show in this kind of seamless way that it just flowed from place to place. Um, and it was I have never seen something like it before. I'm sure somewhere in the world someone has done something like it before. I don't know that I'm going to pretend I came up with something new, but it wasn't based on anything I'd ever seen before. And it was a kind of a tricky way to stage a show. James loved it, and he's the kind of director who's into kind of a difficult, interesting uh, way of doing a show. But it was also a little bit scary. And because we were not rehearsing on the physical set, we were rehearsing in a rehearsal room. Um, they would stage the individual scenes, and then stage manager would come out and pull the furniture away and set up the next one. They do the next scene, and when we got to run-throughs of the show, that's how the whole thing played out. And I felt like I knew where on the real set it was supposed to be, and James knew where it was supposed to be, and I think the stage manager kind of knew about half the time where it was supposed to be, and nobody else in that entire massive cast had a clue what they were doing. They were playing their scenes, but they didn't know how any of it fit together within the set as a whole until we got on stage finally. Um, and they had a couple of days of just blocking rehearsals to kind of learn the set and learn how you moved through it. Um,
So
and
this sounds very complicated. It sounds brilliant, but it sounds complicated. Is this one of the mo more complicated sets that you've designed?
It was the design process was very complicated. I've certainly done things that had more moving parts and were more difficult, but this one was it was complicated because we had to figure all that out, and it was relatively inflexible. The problem was we went ahead with this idea, we built it, we got it on stage, and if on day one of rehearsal it was like, well, this doesn't work, there was nothing to do. We were stuck with it at that point. And what I didn't really realize is how terrified James was, is that maybe it wasn't going to work. And although he never said that to me, but about halfway through our first day on the set, he came up to me and said, "Thank you." And he's very sarcastic. So I thought, oh God, what have I screwed up? He's like sarcastically saying thank you for something that I've ruined. And he said, "No, I mean it. Thank you. It's going to work. It's going to be great." And we never looked back. And it was hard. We were all the way into previews. It was getting it to really function right, getting all of those like change outs of props that sort of help define location, timing that into the action in this constantly moving thing was incredibly, incredibly hard. And it was so massive. It just took forever to get it all dressed out and worked properly, just in terms of like scenic design craft. Staging the show on it was difficult, lighting it was difficult. Everything was sort of hard about it, but it was quite a unique experience. One like
So
just a little
so
funny,
so I'm
funny
curious.
story about
Okay, you go.
one little quick anecdote about it is just funny that it comes up with doing something like this that we never expected is because it was so big and it moved so relatively slowly, it created its own kind of little world. And the actors would move around through it. And as it turned, they lost all sense of where they were in the theater. And people would think they were walking off stage right and suddenly come walking down stage center or go up stage because the thing was so massive, you really didn't have a sense of the world outside of it. And for a day or two, we were really stuck on like how we could like finish blocking the show. And we ended up hanging lights and the red lights on stage right and green lights on stage left in the wings where the audience couldn't see them, but from on stage you could see it through the skeletal structure so that people had something to get their bearings with because they truly didn't know where they were going otherwise.
So this brings me back to collaboration. How was your lighting designer for about all this? And
Well,
who was
Ken, it was Ken
that
Billington,
was my
who's
my pal Ken. Yeah, I know Ken.
yeah. So and thank God because he was great about it. He was excited
Okay.
about it. But I think we had 5 or 6 full dimmer packs like hidden on the set. We had power running into this turntable through the middle. 5 or 6 full dimmer racks hidden on the set, like hidden in trunks or under blankets or something, kind of up in the middle of the set. And I think it was like 126 working circuits around the set for him to be able to light the whole thing with both practicals and lights hidden in nooks and crannies and corners. But it was a real engineering feat to figure out all of that.
But the thing that I was wondering, so it was Ken, so you were lucky. At any point did he have ask you for any adjustments because he couldn't light something that he needed to light?
Um, Not that I remember. The only thing we did is we did add actual like little birdies and inkies, little fixtures into the ceilings basically of some of these spaces, and some of them we masked and some of them we didn't. So that it was probably not part of my original conception, but once he asked for it, I was like, of course you need to get some light in there somehow. Um, but it was also all relatively shallow, as massive as it was. All of the spaces were kind of around the exterior of this ring. So most of the sets themselves were 8 feet deep. They were quite shallow, and a lot of it he could just hit from traditional positions.
I want to take a step back to Off-Broadway and the Obie Award. Your Obie Award was for sustained excellence. So in 2007, how long had you been designing for Off-Broadway?
I mean, I came to New York for graduate school in 1993, and I started designing Off-Broadway probably by the spring of 94. But I got out of graduate school in 96. So I guess 11 years out of school and maybe 12 or 13 kind of being in the community doing stuff.
So do you have any sense of what attracted the Obie? By the way, did you know Michael Feingold?
I did not before that, but yes, I did know him
Yeah,
after
he was
that.
like one of my best friends. So
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
curious, was this a Michael idea? He doesn't always suggest the ideas. There are other people on the panel who
Yeah,
think
I,
so.
I honestly have no idea. I got the Obies are always so mysterious. I got a call saying I think they try to in those days at least they tried to surprise people. Like you were all just supposed to show up at the Obies every year, but I've never been much for a award show, so I'd never been, and I think they realized I wouldn't be there. So I got a call saying, "Look, we would rather if you didn't know this ahead of time, but we're telling you so that you show up."
Well, that was smart of them, I think.
Yes, yes.
Um, so, do you have any sense of what your work, what work attracted them to you in Off-Broadway? Um, any guesses?
I
Um,
really don't. I
I'm
mean, I'm
trying to
trying
get
to
a,
think, but
what
yeah,
were
by
what were
then.
some of the things that you designed Off-Broadway in 2007, 2006, 2005?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that kind of I did Jason Robert Brown's musical the last 5 years. That would have been in 2002. And it was a kind of a big set. I got a Drama Desk nomination for it. The show, although it didn't run long, it sort of everybody saw it. It got a lot of hype because of who Jason was and Daisy Prince, Hal Prince's daughter, directed it. It was sort of the thing that put me on the map in commercial theater. The set was sort of abstract. You actually see it right there, stuck on the wall. But it's a musical about a wedding with a kind of a very peculiar structure with two storylines that are running in opposite directions through time. But the set was it was as if you'd taken a wedding scene on a marble patio and upended it, stuck it sideways, hanging over the stage, kind of smashed into the stage and broken. And then there was a turntable beneath that brought out little bits of props and things to define location. But it was essentially we jokingly called it the divorcicle, but it was about two people who fall in love, get married, get divorced. But it was all told through solos, except one duet in the middle where the man and the woman sing a duet together at their wedding. And conceptually, it was a story about a broken wedding, a broken marriage. or Broken Love Story, and so that's what defined the set. But it also people seem to like the set, and so I think I really credit Daisy in that production with kind of getting me on the radar of commercial people. I just had done an awful lot of Off-Broadway. I don't, that's the one I can point to that I think got some notice. But I worked for a lot of different companies in those days, and I just was doing a lot.
Okay. Let's go back to, well, actually, let me ask Owen. Owen, are there questions in the room that we should be aware of?
The only question I've seen is people really want Beowulf. People really want to know what shows did not win awards that you loved the set that you designed for.
Okay. Um,
That would have been my
um,
question too.
yeah, I mean, look, I love most of the shows that I do. I
Well, let me ask you about one. Tom Pullum was the chairman of my board, and he's like a very good friend of mine. What was it like designing the set for Toxic Avenger?
It was great fun. It was the first show I did with John Rando, and um, again, it was a musical made out of a B movie that I'd never seen. I've since seen, but I had not seen at the time. But about a guy who gets thrown in a vat of toxic sludge in New Jersey and becomes a monster and becomes kind of a superhero. And the musical tried to make him into kind of an eco-friendly green hero who goes about trying to clean up pollution and chase down the people who are polluting the world. Um, and the set we ended up coming up with was basically a junkyard of toxic waste, but it was a massive pile of 50 gallon oil drums uh, that piled up all over the stage and seemed like a just big pile of stuff, but they were it was made in such a way so the band was perched up in one pile, kind of hidden in oil drums, and there were staircases through them that didn't really seem to be there. In the middle of it was a turntable so that this pile of oil drums could revolve and either bring out scenery, little pieces that help define location, or some of the drums were made as little revolving pieces so they could spin around and become a library or become whatever they needed to become. Um, and part of this revolving thing was also the gag that allowed this guy to be thrown in the oil vat and then come back out again as a monster. So they climbed up on top of it. They held him upside down by his legs over a barrel, cartoon style. You saw the actor get dropped in and disappear. And then shortly afterwards, suddenly you see these fists punching through the sides of the barrel, and his hands come out, and the monster comes back out of it with smoke and light and theater effects and so on. But it was again, it was a conception, even though it was sort of a silly musical, it was a conceptually based design. The story was about a planet being destroyed by industry and by toxic waste, and somebody fighting back against that. And so the set was trying to exhibit the sort of destruction of the planet and the piles of garbage and filth everywhere.
Was there was there any shows that you did that just stumped you, and it took you a while to finally figure out what you could do in terms of the set?
Um, the stuff that like springs, I mean, there probably are others that I've spun my wheels on a little bit, and sometimes it takes a while. Again, in the book, I write about Much Ado About Nothing, which I did for Kenny Leon. It was one of the first shows I did for him, and I went through quite a few drafts of that idea before we ended up with the thing that we actually did for Shakespeare in the Park. But it was, I think I always knew it was going to be a house. It was more like how the house was going to fit into the Delacorte and what was the right style of house for the story we were trying to tell and so on. The stuff that has stumped me more tends to be non-script based. I did the Ringling Brothers Circus a couple times and ultimately learned that I'm not great at sort of non-story based visuals. I don't, without the story to hang an idea on, I don't really, as I said, I need the concept before I can figure out the style. And something like the circus is just all style, and it's not really my thing. And early in my career, I tried to design some theme park shows that I was asked to do, and I think one I ended up quitting and one I got fired from because I just couldn't do it. I'm really devoid of story. I get very lost. And I'm just like, well, it could be anything. I don't know what it is. So I do need that. And it doesn't, I've done the James Lapine's review, Sondheim on Sondheim, was a musical review, so there wasn't a story exactly. And that was a tricky one to design and took a while to figure out. but but ultimately the set came to be sort of a sculptural representation of Steve Sondheim, which is a weird thing to say, but that's sort of what it turned into, and Sondheim's approach to musical theater. And so even that was an expression of an idea kind of put into physical form. And once we figured that out, I knew how to do it.
I want to go back to the rooms question. Which sets of yours do you think were you disappointed that you weren't acknowledged for?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to spend honestly too much time
I thought you'd say
like
that, but
grinding an axe about awards because I really do think it is a pointless thing to get hung up on. But Sondheim on Sondheim is a good example. I was really proud of that. I worked really hard on it. I really loved the set. And I think the reviews were mixed of the show, but also of the set. Um, when I was designing it, I was quite sure I was not only going to get nominated for a Tony, but win a Tony for that, and nothing, none of it happened. So that one, I suppose my nose was out of joint about. Uh, I did On the Town with John Rando in 2014, maybe 2015. I don't do a whole lot of revivals. I do mostly new
I was a big
shows.
fan. I was a big fan of that revival, by the way.
I love that production. It's a beautiful show, and I felt really good about how we did it. But it was, in some ways, a very, very simple design. In fact, there's over my I'm putting over my shoulder is the New York City skyline from that set. But it was all made. For those who don't know the entire set was made out of black plexiglass or colored plexiglass, different colored plexiglass. And the idea was it's these three guys who've never been to New York. They're sort of hayseeds showing up in the shiny big city for the first time, and it's a kind of crazy fable. And but everything's kind of glittering and a little not real to them. And that was the jumping off point for the whole set. And it was all a little bit candy colored and trying to be interesting silhouettes, but not realistic scenery at all. And part of that also was just in reaction to I mean, it is real musical comedy. You're not kind of dealing with deep, real emotion in that show, although there's very touching moments to it. Um, and so that's what I was trying to create. And I honestly think that in some ways, because it was sort of flat cutouts, I think people dismissed it and said, "Oh, it's just a simple, silly set, or it's cartoony or something." Tony Walton, the great set designer, wrote to me after he saw it and really, really liked the set and said he thought that On the Town was a notoriously hard show to design and that he loved how I'd figured it out. And that meant a lot to me coming from someone who I respected so much and also someone who was so brilliant at kind of light musical comedy. Um, so those are a couple that I really loved. I also just the Bernstein music in On the Town is so brilliant. It was one show I often do not go back and see my shows after they open. I've spent so much time on them and so watched them in previews every night for a month and spent so much time with them that by the time it's open, I don't have much bandwidth to keep watching the story again. And On the Town ran for about a year, and I probably went back to see it half a dozen times because I just sort of enjoyed letting it wash over me.
Well, I loved it. I'm trying to see whether there are any other questions from the room.
Oh, we
Oh,
have a bunch now. We have a bunch. First, I want to
okay.
point out that Amy Stoller posted a picture of the set
I'm going to
from
do a
Act
screen
One.
share just so everybody can see it. Okay, where is it? Here it is. So this is just one of the shots. So this gives us a little bit of an idea of what you were talking about the complexity and the. So this is obviously going to revolve around. So what we're seeing here is going to be different than when it revolves like every 45 degrees. We're going to see a whole different. Uh,
Yeah, it's not even 45. The thing was so big that it was like probably every 23 degrees there was a new set.
yeah. So I just wanted everybody to see that so that we could really see what a Tony Award looking set looks like. So there we go. So what's next?
Next, I hate to put you on the spot, Trevor, but I want to make sure you get exactly what you want. If you want to come on
Tr
audio to ask your question
Trevor's
about
Trevor is our student, our design student. So
Hi,
I'd love.
Very,
Beowulf.
very,
It's
very nice to meet you.
great to meet you and talk to you. I just wanted to ask how you kind of went about making the transition from undergrad to a graduate program. Like, how did you go on and continue developing design skills and go about networking?
I mean, I went straight from undergrad to graduate school, which may or may not have been the right choice, but I would not have dared move to New York without something to do. Um, although I'd spent a fair, I like went to college in Poughkeepsie, so I would come into New York to see shows. But New York was also a bit scarier in the mid '90s, early '90s than it is now. But I was definitely a small town kid who was scared to move here. So I went straight to graduate school, and while I was in graduate school, started trying to get some jobs professionally during the summer, but also during the year. And the advantage of that is by the time I got out of NYU, I had a bit of a network, and so I had something to, I wasn't making a very good living in those days, but I was doing something to make a living. Um, but the networking question is incredibly important. Not to keep hyping my book, but the last chapter of it is all about that because it's a question I get asked a lot, and these discussions are what kind of led to me writing the book. The book is mostly about kind of case studies of how I design different shows and then interviews with the directors of those shows. But the final chapter is all about this is how you start a career as a designer. The problem is I started as a career as a designer almost 30 years ago. And the world has changed quite a bit since then. And the sad truth is the theater has contracted and there is less opportunity than there was in the mid 90s. If nothing else, the stock market was going bananas in New York in the 90s. And it didn't mean that small shows paid anymore, but there were more of them because I think more of that money was trickling down. But the short answer is if you want to be a set designer, you have to get design jobs or assistant design jobs. Do whatever you can to find those jobs and do them because that's how you will actually start making connections and meeting people that will lead you to your next job. I said the very first thing I did in New York was a production of Titus Andronicus in the South Bronx was my first job. It immediately led to that theater calling me for another show. And an actor in that Titus Andronicus was doing another show with a director friend and recommended me for that. So boom, out of that one job turned into two a month later. And if, not every job will do that, but that is kind of exponentially how a career builds is you do a good job at one thing and somebody sees it and recommends it. The sad part is sometimes you do your best work and nobody notices it and it doesn't lead to anything. So you've got to deal with that part of it too. But it's why you have to do absolutely as much as you can and early in a career, don't turn anything down. Just do it all. Don't sleep, don't eat, don't whatever, for the first few years to try to get as much as you can because you don't know what the thing is that's gonna actually open a door for you in a big way.
Thanks for all that. I think that I feel actually very, very proud of the fact that we were able to introduce somebody to their idol. So I don't know if you know that or not, but he was very, very excited that you're going to be here.
It's very kind of you, Owen. I thank you, thank you, thank you.
Next, we have a question from RK Green asking what considerations you go through when designing for a tour.
It sort of depends. Most of the tours I've done have been something that was on Broadway first, and so it's trying to take the spirit of the Broadway design and figure out a way that it can go into two trucks and load in 8 hours, and all that kind of thing. Which is, to be honest, it's been less hard than I would have expected, or the shows that I've had that have gone on tour have translated reasonably well. But it's a simple example is I did Come From Away on Broadway, and the set was a turntable and a whole bunch of trees. And on Broadway, we used real trees, and it was because of the subject matter. It was about 9/11. More than I usually do. I felt like I want everything on stage to be a real thing, not a scenic representation of a thing, if I can do that. And so I went out into the Adirondacks with a lumberjack and said, I want this one, I want that one, I want that one, and got 30 trees delivered to a scene shop where they flame treated them and sealed them up and stuck chains in the top so we could hang them from the grid. And we brought them into the Schoenfeld Theater, and that's where they lived for the run of the show. But they were massive. The biggest ones weighed about 6,000 pounds each, and even the small ones weighed about 2,000 pounds each. And that is not a good weight for touring things. So when we were sending the show out on the road, my assistant went in, took a lot of pictures of the real trees, and did really, really intricate technical drawings of the real trees. And then we paid a scene shop to make fake versions out of plastic and styrofoam and lightweight things so that they weighed about 150 pounds each. And that is what is still to this day out on the tour of Come From Away. So that's an example of trying to make it look exactly the same, but do it in a different way so that it's more tourable. I've also done a number of kind of just more traditional tours, which were never intended to sit down anywhere. They were just always going to go out on the road. And I tend to do more backdrops or just it's again lighter things that can go into a theater more quickly, or the set has to be smaller in some way. And the tours that have been less successful have been the ones with too much scenery, frankly, where you over if I've over designed it, or in one specific case, the director pushed me to over design it and kept insisting we needed this, needed this, needed this. And it just made the tour unsustainable because it could not load in and out as fast as it had to, and they ended up paying overtime and not meeting deadlines and so on. So the business part of show business is incredibly important. And I stay as I'm talking about all this sort of highfalutin art stuff, but at least half of my job on any given day is how do I make it fit within the budget? How do I make it fit physically within the theater, within the truck it's got to fit into? How do we simplify it so it can load in fast enough? How many crew members does it take to run the show? So I've only got 4 carpenters and 3 prop guys, and I have to tell Susan Stroman she can only have 2 tables in this scene, not 3, because there's not a prop guy to bring it on. So that show business part of my life, the business part of it is a big part of the job.
Off of that, we have a similar question from Susan Crawford, who wants to know your opinions on minimalism in sets, specifically because writers these days have been encouraged to write with quote unit sets and thus some level of minimalism. Do you think audiences are adjusting to that? Leopoldstadt sets, for example, were relatively minimalist.
Um, I think if it's right for the show, it's great. And I think in part because I started doing such like Off-Broadway poor theater, I tend to approach every show as what is the least I can put on stage to tell the story. In a weird way, that's true even of Act One. Yeah, every one of those scenes, I didn't put too much there beyond what was needed, the typewriter, the door, whatever that we needed to actually tell the story of that scene. The way I stuck it together was kind of a maximalist idea. But in fact was kind of the most efficient way I could figure out to get all those locations and all that stuff into a space seamlessly. So sometimes those things lead to kind of very big ideas, but I do tend to be trying to find what's the essence of the story, what's the essence of the visual I need to describe a location, to tell a story, to create a mood, and not put more than that on stage.
Next up,
Next up, we've got Steve Mitchell asking, are you interested in opera? How connected is Broadway and the Met or international opera?
Um, My first exposure to the theater was through opera. My mother trained as an opera singer and used to sing in Opera Memphis when I lived there as a little kid. So my first experience of shows was seeing operas. I have done very little of it, a little bit, but I haven't deeply pursued it. But I've also found that earlier in my career, when I was trying to get more opera work, I more than once had an interview where someone was like, "Well, you've never designed La Boheme before. How could you design this production?" And I thought, I don't know what you're asking. It's no different from anything else. But because I didn't have a lot of opera on my resume, I didn't get hired for it. I stopped pursuing it to a degree. Um, Bizarrely, I just got asked yesterday to do Deflator Mouse in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And I'm not sure I'm going to go to Uzbekistan to do Deflator Mouse, but it's an intriguing idea. Um, and but some people go back and forth quite a lot between the two. My career has not been that way. I've done very little opera.
Janelle Scarborough has had her hand up for a while, so I want to bring her in if she would like to ask her question.
yes, Janelle.
Thank you. So I just wanted to, yes, great conversation. So I wanted to say to both that way back, maybe a decade or so ago, you actually designed a project that I was the initial investor of, Chick Six, and I was a consulting producer. And
Oh,
so I wanted
wow.
to ask you the thing that I really and yeah, that thing that I really admire about your design aesthetic is your ability to design within a budget, right? And so as producers, we're always so budget related, but what I really admire is your ability to not like minimize your artistic vision and actually execute so that it doesn't look budget. Can you talk about that sort of process for you, especially since now you're on these really huge budget, things? How do you sort of your design aesthetic, how has that range of the budgets that you
I
are,
mean, it just
allocated
I
to?
yeah, I'm trying. I mean, I look at what the budget is. If it is in a market or at a place where I haven't worked before, I will often write to the theater and say, can you send me 3 pictures of sets that cost about this much money so I know how much a dollar buys in Utah or in Tashkent or wherever, because it varies massively around the world. And I don't go in and worry. I don't go in and try to budget it per se, but I have a decent ability to estimate that like this is kind of this much scenery, so I can design kind of this much scenery and probably be close to what the budget is, or at least in the right range. Um, and I do take it very seriously. I mean, sometimes I'll read a play also, and I'll say like it's asking for a swimming pool on stage, and you have 50 cents, so we can't do that. Like we can't do a literal swimming pool, and I'll try to be like blunt about that as well. That doesn't happen that often, but sometimes I'm being asked for something that just you just can't buy for the money. Um, but so I try to be aware of it. I until recently, I would say I was very good about not ever going out over budget. Post-pandemic, the inflation has gone bananas, as everybody knows from their everyday life. But I would estimate that Broadway scenery costs 70% more now than it did in 2019. And
Actually, that's the figure I've heard.
yeah, it is,
Hmm.
and that might be low. I think to do a musical on Broadway right now, I'm spending $1.5 million on the set. And if it's less than that, it better be basically no set. And and that the amount of scenery I'm getting on stage would have been an, I don't know, $800,000 set 5 years ago. Um, and so that the first few times that happened, that was a shock. And it led to things going massively over budget, and there wasn't time to go back and kind of retrench and figure it. We would make cuts, but when you're 70% over, you're either, cutting nearly half of the set, or the producer's coming up with more money one way or the other. And so, but with those exceptions, I take it quite seriously. I feel like that's part of my job. I'm being hired to work within whatever the budget is. If I think it's impossible, I should say that off the bat and either not take the job or say, if you want this, you need to provide more money. Um, and once we're all agreed to that, I will do my best to keep it within budget and try to insist, make my director understand, find ways to be economical about it, find clever ways to make things look like more than they are. I feel like a lot of my job in the past few years, and it's not really my favorite way of doing things, is just trying to figure out clever ways to make one thing look like 3 things. Because it's even if the one thing is a little complicated because of that, it still costs less money than building 3 things. I'm doing Smash on Broadway in the spring, and the set is full of really, really clever transformations that nobody will ever see because they're all stagehands doing them backstage to make one thing into something else so that it can come back out and look like a different thing. But it's not the kind of fun on stage Broadway transformation where you see it happen in front of you, because the show isn't structured in a way that sort of called for that. And so it's a great deal of energy going into stuff that helps the show function and hopefully makes the show better, but the audience will not understand that it's happening.
I do want to ask you, Beowulf, do you have a hard out at 6:30? Do you have a little flexibility?
I have a little flexibility, yeah. Yeah, I probably
Okay.
need to be out by 6:45, but yes.
Okay. So,
All
because
right.
there were more questions, and before we go to Judith, though, I do want to say I didn't go back. I didn't get to the collaborator question I wanted to ask you, which is basically the use of color and how you work with a lighting designer to determine what will work and what won't work, and how you work together.
I mean, I think with all collaboration with other designers, I've done it enough now that I know the things that are likely to make someone else's job harder. If the set is all white, it makes the lighting designer's job harder. It doesn't mean that the set can't be all white. It just means I need to have a conversation with my lighting designer and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Are you okay with it? Are you willing to whatever? Or I'm going to make the whole set a mirror. It's going to make it harder for the lighting designer. I'm going to put a ceiling on the set. It's going to make it harder for the lighting designer. I did Harmony a year ago on Broadway, and it was a mirrored set with a ceiling on it. So the first thing I did was call Jules and Peggy and said, "This is what I want to do. It's going to make your job really difficult." And luckily, the two of them were incredibly excited about how do we tackle this problem. We haven't done this before, and they solved it uh, beautifully and brilliantly.
One,
Same
one
with
of
the
the
costume designer.
one of the
If
Harmony
I,
producers is in the room, by the way.
oh,
So
excellent, excellent.
RK
Um,
Green.
uh, and it's same with costume designers. If I'm gonna if I'm going to make the set red, I better call my costume designer and say, hey, it's all going to be red, and the show better not be Annie because then we've got a problem because she's got to have a red dress on. So it's there. Those are the kind of things I try to be aware of, and just have the conversation. It doesn't mean we can't do it. And I probably there are things I do that make their lives difficult that I'm not clocking also, but we try to talk about those things.
I always ask the question because I produced a show in which the lighting designer and the set designer almost killed each other. It was so I don't know where we went wrong because we had conversations at the start before anybody started doing the work, but what the set designer designed and what the lighting designer had in mind had never been really uh, discussed in enough detail. So yes, please have those
Yeah, I will
conversations.
say also that, there's a hierarchy in what we do, and in theory, all the designers are sort of on the same level. But the reality is that the set designer, 99% of the time, I come in first and I design it, and it's well on its way to being a concrete idea before anyone else gets involved. And so if I've designed a red set and the costume designer comes in and says, "Oh, but I want all the clothes to be red," it's probably too late. And if the lighting designer, you know, doesn't like the mirrored set idea and we're that far along, I'm probably not going to change the mirrored set. I might change the lighting designer. And so it's to a degree, I think the other designers do need to fall in line and presumably it's not me dictating that. I've come up with an idea that the director likes, and we're pushing forward in this direction. And everybody else has to kind of roll into that. And it doesn't mean that they can't express concerns, whatever, um, but I find at least, and maybe this is just the way I approach things, but the other designers I work with tend to all sort of play ball that way. And they're working within that world that I'm creating. I'm working within the world the director is creating. And the director is working within the world the writer has created. So there is a hierarchy to that. And just as I wouldn't walk in and say to the writer, well, I don't think you should have a scene set there, it's a given. I mean, the writer can cut that scene if they want, and I can say it's hard to put a scene on a boat or whatever I might say to them. But if that's what they want, it's my job to play within that world. If the director wants tap dance in the show, it's not my job to say, but I really, really want a mirrored floor. You can't tap dance on that. The answer is I can't have a mirrored floor. I have to get them a tap floor. It's the same for the lighting designer and the costume designer and everybody else. Like the world continues to evolve, and you have to work within the parameters that it is evolving.
Well, the takeaway for those of you who haven't produced is that you have to make sure that your designers do talk to each other. It's
Yes,
it's
yes.
crucial. It's crucial. Judith Minus.
Hi, Beowulf. We actually
Hi,
had,
Judith. Yes, I remember meeting you. Yeah.
yeah. I have two questions that really might pertain to Trevor a bit. The first thing was I was Ken's first assistant, and when I decided to transfer to switch to stage managing, I had a long conversation with Theron, who said to me, "Do not take any lighting jobs because everybody has you pigeonholed in that." And so I was able to do that. And I just wondered if it's still that way because everybody seems to be very hyphenated in talents. Um, so if they're still not taking people seriously, doing one, because they're doing so many things, if that's still the case. And the other question is, if you have time to just touch on the 152 project, which I think is terrific.
Oh, sure, of course.
I
The,
promised you that we would talk about it too.
yeah,
Yes.
so the multi-hyphenate thing is certainly something that the current younger generation loves. And the truth is, I think when you're young, you have to try to do a bit of everything. I did a bit of everything when I was young. I think I always called myself a set designer, but I did a little bit of a lot of things. Um, but my eye was sort of always on set design as the thing I wanted to do. So you have to make choices that push you in that direction. But also, I designed costumes, I designed lights, I directed, produced, all this other stuff to try to like figure out who I was and what I wanted to do. Um, and um, I think the industry still does pigeonhole people. I think it's hard for people to be more than one thing, and it's hard to get. If you call yourself six things, I think it's harder to get jobs in any one of those things because people think you're not serious. That's the advice I give to younger people. I may be wrong about that, and it's possible that this, the upcoming generation feels like everyone should be able to do everything, and as they take over the world, perhaps that will be true. But but my experience was as yours. Like you try this, you try that, you move into this. And once I decided I didn't want to do costumes anymore, I sort of stopped doing costumes. I stopped looking for those jobs, and I was more likely to turn them down. And eventually it sort of trickled off and I just didn't design costumes anymore. But I would always say yes to the set design jobs and grab for more of them and so on. So that's what I think the answer is to that, but I don't know. That's just my opinion. For those who don't know about the 152 project, I'll try to be succinct in this, but it came about largely in reaction to both the Me Too movement in the last decade and the We See You White American Theater movement, but two movements, social movements within the theater, pointing out that the theater is a white man's game, as the country is and maybe the world is. So certainly the country is. But that we think of ourselves as sort of very woke, open industry where if you're good enough, anyone can get ahead. And the statistics belie that. And it's hard for women to get a job, and it's hard for people of color to get a job. And I will say that I was quite aware that women were not hired, that it was very much a man's business. I was less aware about people of color and was a little ashamed of myself when it was pointed out to me how wrong I was. It wasn't that I just honestly thought people of color were not trying to get the jobs, not that they weren't being given the opportunities. But once these sort of movements rose up and really pointed them out, I felt um, I felt like a bad person. I felt like a jerk. That because I bit of my own history is my father was born a Jew in fascist Hungary in 1940. Survived the Holocaust, survived the Nazis, eventually escaped Hungary during the revolution by running across a border, uh, and came to the U.S. as a 16-year-old kid with $1 in his pocket and lived the American dream. The guy managed to get to college eventually. He started as a washing dishes in the Adirondacks, but he got to college eventually. He got a master's degree. He eventually was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize as a writer of American history, but he lived the American dream, and I was raised in a very comfortable middle class American family. And the fact that that is not open to everybody, or as open as it was to him as a white man, and as a career has been to me as a white man, bugs me because it just feels un-American. I think we have this ideal of all men are created equal, but try to say that that means all people are created equal. And it is in fact not true. It may be true under the law, we hope. It is certainly not true in society. And all you have to do is like really open your eyes and look around and see that it's not true. Um, and so these movements started pushing back against it. And I thought, what can I do as a set designer to help with this? Maybe not much, but at that point, it was during the pandemic, so nothing was running at that point. But Come From Away had been running on Broadway. I assumed it would continue running afterwards. And I thought, if I gave 1 week's royalties out of this show into a fund, and I could convince every other designer working on Broadway to do the same, we very quickly would have a lot of money. It wouldn't actually hurt anybody very much because it's 1/52nd of your royalty income that you're not even really doing anything for. So it's a tiny drop in the bucket that everyone is giving, and you could raise a lot of money and give it as a grant to young designers. Initially I thought people of color. We eventually decided uh, to say people from historically excluded groups, and have explicitly made that include all women, white women as well, with over time, over the 3 years of this thing existing. And I started putting this together. I think initially I had the idea, I thought, oh, this could work. And I kept pitching it to people, hoping someone would say, that's a great idea. I know how to do it. And in fact, what everyone said is, that's a great idea. You should do it. And I kept saying, I'm a set designer. I know how to do this. But I finally, after about 6 months, realized if I wanted it to happen, I had to do it. And long story short, I put together a group of people, and started just calling everybody I knew and didn't know as Broadway shows reopened and said, will you put money into this? And we've been around for 3 years now. We're just starting our fourth cycle. We've raised close to $400,000, given out over $350,000 in grants. One of our first recipients, a young Latina woman named Stefania Bulbarella, a year later got a Tony nomination for her first Broadway show. Mexley Cuisine, a Latina lighting designer, uh, got her first Broadway show within a year of getting the grant. I don't think the grant caused either of those things to happen, but in Stefania's case, she told me she didn't have any money in her savings account when we handed her $15,000 and said, "Here, do whatever you want with it." And it allowed her to stop doing subsistence jobs, to stop programming video and start designing video, to take a lower paying design job rather than a higher paying programming job. And it gave her opportunity, and it gave her a little breathing room. Um, and those are the great success stories of it. But um, that is what the 152 project is. I will say that ever since starting it, I have kicked myself about 360 days out of the year because it's a pain in the ass to run. It's a lot of management. It's a lot of me pounding the pavement, asking people for money. Most people saying no, but enough people saying yes that we've been able to raise all this money. Um,
So,
and but then
Let me
then
ask you,
there,
if somebody wants to donate to it, can you tell the audience what the website
Yes,
would be?
if you Google one, the website is oneevery52.org. If you Google 152 designer project, anything like that, it should bring it up. I can maybe I can send you just the direct link, Bob, afterwards, and you can send it out to your group. Um, but oh, thanks, Amy. I can see you're popping it up there. We have in the past year gotten a lot of the shops that provide the scenery and the lighting and the sound equipment for Broadway to begin donating to this. So the thing is sort of churning along, and I hope really doing some good in the world. And what is rewarding about it is how many people do say yes. That people want to help. People want to help young people in the industry, and the early careers the early years as a designer are really, really hard. As I said, I've been incredibly lucky. I had a lot of lucky breaks, and it's just difficult in the first few years. And I was a straight white boy coming into this business as a person of color with maybe fewer connections, with maybe fewer producers, directors recognizing themselves in that person. It's just a little bit harder. My breaks in life were that James Lapine and Hal Prince both hired me, but they were two white guys who kind of recognized this ambitious kid, and gave me a chance. And there is, we all have those biases, whether we like them or not. And so I'm quite passionate about this. And also just selfishly as a theater goer, I would rather see some more diverse stories. One of my favorite plays in the past few years was Jaja's African Hair Braiding. And when I heard the title, I thought, what the fuck is that? But then I realized my friend Jocelyn had written it, and I thought, well, I'll go see this. And I love the play. I think she brilliantly just tells almost Chekhovian stories where she takes like the little irritations of life and raises them to kind of dramatic stature, so you want to watch them on stage. But mostly it was a world I could never experience. I could walk into one of those places as a white guy, but it would not exist the way it does when a bunch of black women are in a place like that. And so getting to see that little slice of the world on stage for 90 minutes was fascinating and brilliant to me. And it's not that that's the only story I want to see. I want to see all sorts of stories, but I do genuinely believe that more diversity of artists and more diversity of storytellers, it just leads to a more breadth of storytelling, and it's more interesting. And quite frankly, as a designer, I feel the difference in the room when it's a more diverse group and it's not just six guys who look like me and have my educational background and all of that. At the very least, a room that is divided equally between men and women, the tone of the room is massively different, and I find much more pleasant, to be honest. Um, and then you get an ethnic or a racial diversity in there too, and you get other opinions, and it makes the stories richer and more interesting.
We have another question. I was going to end here, but Drew asks a question that I think I do want to ask. Musical book writers, well, all playwrights are often told not to include too much set description in a script. How much is the right amount in your opinion? Um,
Um, Only what you absolutely need. Honestly, as I read it, even if there is a lot of description, what I go through is look at the action. And, if someone walks through a door, then I need a door. If someone's cooking breakfast, I need a stove and a frying pan, or yeah, probably. That's the stuff I read. So you can write a novel about what you think the room looks like, and at least I'll read it. But I will probably not follow it too closely, unless the tone of the dialogue and the action then falls exactly in place with it. But what I'm interested in is the words the actors are saying to the audience and what they're doing on stage. Those are the things that I'm trying to support with the set. I just was in a talk back with a playwright who said, I put a lot of description in. I described this set as a cross between Maurice Sendak and Chagall or something like that. And I said to her, like, you can write that, but unless your dialogue and your action also feels like a cross between Maurice Sendak and Chagall, I'm going to ignore that you said that because I don't think it's actually what you mean. So that's maybe an arrogant thing for a set designer to say, but I I try to find what is essential and what is essential to the physical storytelling, and start with that at least before I go into anything else.
Well, this has been fabulous. It's now the dreaded 6:45 that you talked about. So I'm going to do my final wind up for YouTube. I want to thank everybody in the room. Beowulf, you're incredibly articulate and incredibly interesting. I want to spend more time
Thank
with
you.
you. I really enjoyed being with you. Um,
It was a
and
pleasure talking to everyone.
well, thank you, and thank you to the room. Thank you to my community. I hope that I'll see you again next week and the week after, um, and thank you to the people out there who are discovering us on YouTube or in the podcast. That we're about a year and a half behind on our podcast, but we're going to catch up. So if you want to be in the room and you want to actually have have questions that you can ask and maybe meet our panelists, you can just email me at trunltd@aol.com. That's trunltd@aol.com. And I'll send you a Zoom link. Well, my assistant will send you a Zoom link every week. So you'll know what we're doing and how to get into the room and be part of it. Um, we've been doing this since 2020 as a community service. We have expenses. I still welcome people to come for free. If you can't pay anything, just come in and be part of the community. It's absolutely fine. If you can help us, if you want to support us, this is an end of year donor drive we're doing now anyway. But you can come to trudonate.com. That's trudonate.com. Just type that in into your browser, and it'll take you to a donation page. We'd appreciate the help. We'd appreciate whatever support you can all give us. And I do want to remind everybody that Beowulf is doing some pretty amazing work for underrepresented members of our community who would like to get a leg up in theater. So please, the website that he was trying to get you to is let me find it now. It's one every 52. So it's www.one, O-N-E, every, E-V-E-R-Y, 50, F-I-F-T-Y, 2, T-W-O. So it's www.oneevery52.org. So please send him support as well. If you have a choice between True and Beowulf, I really like what he's doing. So do support him. Support us if you can. And see you next week, I hope, and in the weeks to come. That's it.